Hi, friends, and welcome to the Inner Child Revolution podcast. I want to start this new chapter with something that might surprise some of you, especially if you've been following my work for a little while. I no longer call myself a narcissistic trauma healing expert, and I want to share why. Not because I think that work was wrong or that narcissistic abuse isn't real and deeply painful, but because my understanding of what's actually happening in these dynamics has evolved. And honestly, because I started seeing how deeply this shows up in people's businesses, their money patterns, and their leadership. When I first started doing this work, naming narcissism was incredibly empowering for me. And it gave me language to experiences that felt really confusing, crazy making, and invisible. And that matters. That absolutely still matters. But over time, I started to notice something. That framework, while helpful in the beginning, can also keep people oriented towards the problem outside of themselves. And it can quietly reinforce this idea that healing comes from understanding what's wrong with someone else instead of remembering who you are. And that doesn't just affect our relationships, it affects your business, it affects your pricing, it affects your visibility, it affects how you show up and what you think you're allowed to receive. So when I say I don't use that label anymore, it's not because I've stopped caring about relational trauma. It's because I don't want to anchor my work in a model that centers attention on pathology or blame or permanent damage. Because I'm much more interested now in liberation rather than explanation. And there's a difference between being validated in your pain and being free from organizing your life around it. And I started to realize that a lot of people were recovering somewhat from narcissistic relationships, but they were still running their businesses from the same survival identity those relationships created. So, one of the biggest shifts for me has been realizing that narcissism isn't just a personality disorder that a few people have, it's a dynamic, it's an entity, and it shows up in relationships, in family systems, in workplaces, spiritual communities, corporations, and entire systems. So you don't have to have a narcissist in your life to be living inside a narcissistic dynamic. Anytime power, attention, validation, or control flows in one direction, anytime one person disappears to keep another person regulated, and anytime someone is objectified or used as a means to an end, that's a narcissistic pattern. You see, most people don't realize that you can be completely free from a narcissistic partner or other close relationship and still be running your business inside a narcissistic dynamic. And that shows up, in your clients, in your audience, and it's your own inner critic. Here's what I find really interesting. Both from a psychological and a spiritual perspective, narcissism is rooted in what's called the false self, right? But what I want to talk about here isn't the person who has a false self. It's what happens to the people who learn to survive inside someone else's false self reality. Because when you grow up in an environment or stay in a relationship where your authentic self isn't safe, you don't just adapt to them. You start abandoning yourself and you learn to edit your truth. You soften your needs, you doubt your perceptions, you override your intuition. It's not because you're weak, it's because connection felt conditional. And over time, something really subtle happens. You stop sourcing yourself from your own inner world, or you never did. And you start sourcing yourself from someone else's moods, reactions, expectations, and approval. And you begin organizing your life around keeping the peace instead of honoring your truth. That pattern doesn't just stay in your relationships, it follows you into your business. Because what I see all the time is people building their brands that are designed to get approval instead of expressing their truth. Or people underpricing because they're afraid they're going to be rejected, misunderstood, or judged. People overgiving content, time, and energy because they're trying to earn safety. Or people terrified to be visible because somewhere inside, visibility still feels dangerous. That's not a marketing problem. That's a self-sourcing problem. And it's what happens when you learned that staying connected meant disappearing a little bit. This is where a lot of people get confused about something called narcissistic supply. Because what I'm not really talking about here is a label, but I'm talking about a dynamic you may have learned to live inside your inner world. So when you spend time in a relationship where someone else needs constant energy, where they need constant attention or constant reassurance or emotional regulation, then you slowly learn that your job is to be the supply. You become the stabilizer, the mirror, the peacekeeper, the emotional container. And over time, something really subtle happens. You stop sourcing yourself from your own inner world, and you start sourcing yourself again from other people's reactions, moods, and approval. So instead of asking, what feels true for me, you start asking, will this upset someone? Will this make me unsafe? Will this make me unlovable? And that's why these dynamics feel like a black hole in relationships, because your energy is always flowing outward. And that same pattern shows up in your business. Because if your sense of worth, safety, or legitimacy comes from likes on Facebook, or sales, or clients' feedback, or your launch results, or your audience growth, how big your email list is, then your business becomes a constant emotional roller coaster. That's not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're still externally sourcing your sense of self. And this is where spirituality comes in. Because spiritual awakening is the exact opposite movement. It's the moment you realize I am my own source, and my inner world is primary, and my consciousness is creative. You see, Neville Goddard said, our consciousness is all there is. And when you start living from that knowing, you don't need to chase clients to get sales. You don't need to shrink your offers to feel safe. You don't need to contort yourself into a pretzel. You don't need to perform worthiness to deserve existence. You're already sourced, and your business gets to be an expression of that, not a substitute for it. And this is why inner child work matters so much here, because what you're really healing isn't narcissistic trauma, but you're healing a part of you that learned it wasn't safe to be fully real. You're healing the part of you that learned if I stay small, I'll stay connected. Or if I don't need too much, I won't be abandoned. Or if I make myself easy to deal with, I'll be loved. That is not a flaw. That's intelligence. And that's a child doing whatever they had to do to survive emotionally. So healing isn't about understanding someone else's psychology. It's about restoring your connection to yourself as your primary source. And it's about teaching your nervous system and your inner child, because they're synonymous, that you are safe to exist as you are. You don't have to disappear to be loved. You don't have to overgive to be chosen. You don't have to undercharge to stay connected. And you don't have to earn your right to take up space. And I want to be really clear about something here, okay? This does not mean stay in an abusive relationship. This doesn't mean you're spiritualizing harm. It doesn't mean you're bypassing boundaries. It means healing in a way that doesn't keep your identity anchored to what someone else did to you. And it means becoming the adult in your own life and business, the one who chooses from self-trust instead of self-protection, and the one who leads from inner authority instead of external permission. So this work matters even if you don't think narcissistic trauma is your issue, because these dynamics live on a spectrum. So a lot of people who come into my world are overgivers, overthinkers, overadapters. They're high capacity, high empathy people who learned early that love meant self-erasure. And what that looks like in business is hiding instead of leading, or discounting instead of owning your value, waiting for permission instead of making offers, staying small instead of being seen. So you don't have to be in a dramatic, toxic relationship to be disconnected from your sovereignty. Sometimes it looks quiet, sometimes it looks functional, and sometimes it looks like success with a constant low-grade emptiness underneath. The deeper work, the liberating work, is turning back towards your own inner world. It is beginning to see how you were taught to participate in that dynamic. Because at some point, disappearing a little bit felt safer than standing fully in your own truth. And this is where your inner child becomes key, because your inner child holds the patterns that shaped your self-concept and your identity. And it's where you learned who you had to be to stay connected, or who you weren't allowed to be to stay safe, and what love, power, and worth were supposed to look like. So I'm not here to help you stay focused on what's wrong with other people. I'm here to help you remember who you are underneath all the adaptations, and to consciously change your identity to match who you're becoming now, not who you had to be to survive. And maybe the real question isn't, is there a narcissist in my life? Maybe the real question is, where am I looking outside myself for permission, validation, or safety? Because that's the pattern that keeps showing up in our relationships. And it's the same pattern that keeps showing up in our businesses. And if you're a coach or a healer or a conscious entrepreneur, and you know that you are meant for more visibility, more income, more impact, but something inside you keeps putting on the brakes, that is exactly what I work with. And I'm hosting a free masterclass where I'll teach you my 4-step method for breaking toxic cycles so you can stop overgiving, stop undercharging, and stop staying invisible. Start building your business from self-trust, from clarity in your real voice. So there's a link to register right here in the show notes. It's free, and it's a powerful next step if you're ready to step into leadership, self-sourcing, and deeper alignment. I would love to support you there, because you don't have to stay in the healing mode forever, and you don't have to stay small to stay safe, because that's the revolution. That's the inner child revolution, and that's what this podcast is really about. And I am so glad you're here. We will take this one step at a time together.